A New Heaven and a New Earth by Maurice Nicoll from the book The Mark. John the Baptist. The strange remark of Christ about the kingdom of heaven being taken by violence, and how the violent seize it by force, must be taken in connection with John the Baptist, and what Christ says about him. It will be best, therefore, to quote in full the incident as recorded in Matthew. Now when John heard in the prison the works of the Christ, he sent by his disciples, and said unto him, Art thou he that cometh, or look we for another? And Jesus answered and said unto them, Go your way, and tell John the things which ye do hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good tidings preached to them. And blessed is he whosoever shall find none occasion of stumbling in me. And as these went their way, Jesus began to say unto the multitudes concerning John, What went ye out into the wilderness to behold? A reed shaken by the wind? But what went ye out for to see? A man clothed in soft raiment? Behold, they that wear soft raiment are in kings' houses. But wherefore went ye out? To see a prophet? Yea, I say unto you, and much more than a prophet. This is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before thy face, who shall prepare thy way before thee. Verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women there hath not arisen a greater than John the Baptist. Yet he that is but little in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and men of violence take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied unto John, and if ye are willing to receive it, this is Elijah which is to come. Matthew chapter 11, verses 2 to 14. First of all, note that Christ said, From the time of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and men of violence take it by force. The phrase until now can only mean until I, Christ, came. It is clear that the path followed by John the Baptist was not the same as the teaching of Christ, and this is implied all through the passage if we begin to grasp what was meant by such phrases as a reed shaken, kings' houses, soft raiment, and so on. We know that the Baptist was clad not in soft raiment, but in skins. John himself had his raiment of camel's hair, and a leathern girdle about his loins. Matthew chapter 3, verse 4. And it is clear that Christ refers to John the Baptist in a special way in saying that, although he is the greatest of those born of women, the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. We can only understand this as meaning that the Baptist was on one level of understanding, but not on the level of the understanding of the least in the kingdom of heaven, and therefore that John's teaching was on a different level from the level of Christ's teaching. John is surprised that Christ's disciples do not fast, that they drink wine and so on, while the Baptist disciples fast and abstain. The disciples of John were sent to Christ to ask, Why do we and the Pharisees fast oft, but thy disciples fast not? So John doubts Christ. Art thou indeed the Christ? Matthew chapter 11, verse 3. The behaviour of Christ obviously worried the Baptist. He could not understand Christ. He saw the attainment of the higher level of being, called the kingdom of heaven, as lying through violence to oneself, through abstinence, the keeping of rituals and fasts, the literal keeping of the word at all moments and under every circumstance. There was no doubt little mercy in his harsh outlook and harsh understanding of truth. His understanding perhaps rested on the literal meaning of the doctrines he followed. The Sabbath day was, perhaps, to him, an exact literal observation of the commandment. Nothing must be done. No one must ever be healed on the Sabbath. If he ever heard of Christ's remark when accused by the literal-minded Pharisees of breaking the Sabbath, he would not have understood it. The Pharisees had blamed Christ's disciples for plucking and eating the ears of corn as they walked through the cornfield, saying, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? They blamed Christ for healing on the Sabbath. Christ said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath," a thing difficult to the understanding of many today. Mark chapter 2, verse 27. Up to the time of the appearance of John the Baptist, the kingdom of heaven had been prophesied as something that would come in the future. For all the prophets and the law prophesied unto John. Matthew chapter 11, verse 13. But the Baptist, as herald of Christ, taught that the kingdom was now here, now present, immediate. It was a time of crisis. He cried, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand," meaning in the person of Christ on earth. Why then did he not follow Christ when Christ came to be baptized by him? At one moment he seems to recognize Christ, at another moment he seems to doubt. It has always been extraordinary to me that the Baptist, on meeting Christ, did not unmistakably know him and follow him, straightway, as Mark would have put it. Sometimes I thought that Christ was cold to John, that even he did not like him. And yet when the Baptist was beheaded for interfering with the marriage affairs of Herod, when Jesus heard it, he withdrew from thence in a boat to a desert place apart. Matthew chapter 14, verse 13. No doubt that he gave John's spirit force then, for later, when Christ was transfigured on the mountain, did not Moses appear on one side of him and Elijah on the other? Behold, there appeared unto them, the disciples, Moses and Elijah talking with him. Matthew chapter 17, verse 3. And had not Christ already told his disciples concerning John, "If ye will receive it, this is Elijah which is to come"? Matthew chapter 11, verse 14. It is almost as if Christ did not want to work on him in life, but did his work on him after his physical death, when he could reach him better. Certainly at the Transfiguration, John was no longer wearing skins and leather, but was clad in light. It is said in one gospel, "There talked with him two men, which were Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory." Luke chapter 9, verses 30-31. We know that by withdrawal and long meditation we can give force to another person, for this is one form of intelligent sacrifice. How much more, then, could Christ do this, to both the physically living and dead? Did he not give force to Peter living, where Luke records that Christ said to Peter, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan asked to have you, that he might sift you as wheat. But I made supplication for thee, that thy faith fail not, and do thou, when once thou hast turned, establish thy brethren." Luke chapter 22, verses 31-32. Seen thus, there is John the Baptist, the greatest of men, born of woman, but not in the kingdom of heaven, and John the Baptist transfigured by Christ, and so in the kingdom, no more a man born of woman, but a man reborn, and so beyond violence. Did not Christ say to his mother, "Woman, what have I to do with thee?" when he had reached that level of inner development, the outer sign of which was his power to transform water into wine? To take the word of the law literally is to do violence to others and to oneself. The literal sense, say, of a parable does not convey its inner levels of meaning. Literal truth is without mercy, grace, or charity, and can be most crude and most violent in its results, as we see in religious persecutions. The harsh clothing of the Baptist is contrasted with the soft raiment of those who live in kings' palaces. A man is clothed psychologically in the things he follows. The mind is clothed in the truth it holds to. To change one's mind, metanoia, is to clothe it anew with new thoughts and new truths. John the Baptist taught this metanoia. It is translated as repent, but it means change your mind. Yet, taking his clothing as representing his teaching, he is shown in harsh vesture, living in the wilderness. He cried, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Here we can understand that this metanoia, this change of mind, had reference to the fact that the kingdom of heaven was an actuality, and that men had to begin to think of their meaning on earth in view of this supreme selective kingdom, far more important than any kingdom on earth. John did not know the teaching of Christ, but he was the first to say that the kingdom of heaven is not in the future, but now. There are, then, 3 teachings here about the kingdom. The prophets spoke of things that were to come. The kingdom was to come in the future. The Baptist said the kingdom is at hand, and so was greater than the prophets. Yea, said Christ of him, and much more than a prophet. And Christ later said, the kingdom of heaven is within you. That is, not in the future or in some locality, a thing which perhaps the Baptist had not grasped. For external literal truth does not grasp internal psychological spiritual truth. Yes, heaven is not a place above and hell not below in space. Heaven and hell are within a man. So we notice that the conception of the kingdom lay first in the future in time, then as being present in time and space, and finally as being in a man himself apart from external time and space. In thinking of the 2 most enigmatical figures to me in the Gospels, John the Baptist and Judas Iscariot, I have often wondered what the Baptist would have thought of the many parables Christ used to illustrate what the kingdom of heaven is, usually beginning with the words, the kingdom of heaven is likened unto ... No doubt with his harsh literal conceptions of truth, the Baptist thought of the kingdom as a place that one had to take by force, by some tremendous effort over the flesh, by every sort of self-denial. But, if so, Christ says that this is not the way. The harshness is no good. It is not the way into the kingdom. Christ asked whether in going to see the Baptist in the wilderness, where his food was locusts and wild honey, the people expected to see something weak, a reed shaken by the wind. If so, they were wrong. The Baptist was strong, as a man born of woman, which is the first birth. But all esoteric religion teaches a second birth, as did Christ when he said, ye must be born again from above. Are we to think that John realized this? Are we to imagine from what Christ says of him that he had grasped what can take a man into the kingdom? It seems to me that the answer is no. He thought that, as he was, a natural man, a man born of woman, he could take the kingdom of heaven by violence to his appetites. And it seems that for a brief period this was possible. From the time of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom suffereth violence, but certainly not after. In bringing in this contrast to the Baptist's harsh method, Christ speaks of those clad in soft raiment. They, he implies, are in the kingdom. They were capable of understanding far beyond the rigid literal word, and where the Baptist saw only one thing, they saw 1,000 things. They were flexible, not rigid. Their understanding was not keeping literally a law. They had mercy, charity, and above all, relative thinking. They were, in brief, on another level of understanding, wider, more intelligent and gracious, where narrow, rigid truth no longer was put before the lovely wideness of goodness, but where the marriage of truth and good had taken place within them, so that literal truth was never allowed to go before goodness, and so where no one could do non-goodness in the name of truth, and no one could hate or kill his neighbour in the name of literal truth. For if you put narrow, rigid truth before goodwill and goodness, you are clad, as the Baptists, in harsh skins and leather, and the food of your goodness is locusts and wild honey, and your dwelling place is the wilderness, barren of all life. So we find in the Gospel of John, which has nothing to do with John the Baptist, that Jesus is described by the beloved disciple in these terms, and we beheld him full of grace and truth. Yes, grace first, and truth from grace after. One therefore asks, is the kingdom of heaven, if it is within us, some conscious state of understanding that is sometimes open and sometimes shut? Then one might easily say, if this is so, can people press into it only at different times in the world's history? I would add, is this then the good news, namely that now a man, a woman may enter because in the flux of things the doors happen to be open? Do you remember the man who got into the kingdom of heaven wrongly? I quote from the parable of the marriage feast. When the king came in to behold the guests, he saw there a man which had not on a wedding garment. And he saith unto him, Friend, how camest thou in hither not having a wedding garment? And he was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, Bind him hand and foot, and cast him into the outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few chosen. Matthew chapter 22, verses 11 to 14. One can see that this man had not at least the soft raiment that Christ spoke of. Sheer, unmerciful truth is not a wedding garment. A relaxing and releasing thought to many, brought up under an interpretation of Christ's teaching based solely on literal truth, but with no inner mercy and no goodwill, and no trace of psychological understanding. Is it not extraordinary how the literal word-for-word meaning is still upheld without the slightest idea that this is not enough and is not real understanding, and then in such an interpretation of Christ, such a man, causing endless perplexity and pain to others, has no wedding garment and is destined to be turned out of the kingdom? Is it too much to say that such a man, so formidable in the literal interpretation of truth, who theorizes from pulpits, a man who perhaps condemns everyone, who regards man as made for the Sabbath and refuses to believe that the Sabbath was made for man, is one who, having no grace or inner charity or human kindness, and so no wedding garment, is nothing but a man of self-will and violence, and not a man at all in the sense of Christ. It is just as if people might imagine that by going to church regularly all their lives they are already in the kingdom of God. Is it not clear that this cannot be the case, and that metanoia and rebirth is the essential and real meaning of all that Christ taught, and that no one is in a real sense a Christian? And worse still, that so many think they are so. Only Christ himself was a Christian. Why? Because he united perfectly in himself the human mother side with the divine side, and rendered the connection between heaven and earth open again at a stage in human history when all connection was being lost and mankind was being cut off from all higher values and so higher direction. The teaching of Christ. The problem of esoteric teaching is to connect a higher level of understanding with a lower level. The supreme example is Jesus Christ, who was born of a human mother and yet was the Son of God. We can understand nothing about the drama of Jesus Christ unless we understand that he was in a way two things, the Son of Man and the Son of God. This means that he was in contact with a lower level and yet in some way in contact with a higher level. Speaking in a more general way, the problem of esoteric teaching, which is sown into the earth at definite intervals, is to maintain some kind of contact with a higher level of being. When contact between the upper and lower notes is lost, all that is below perishes, goes mad, and ends in violence. Christ came as a mediator between the higher and lower level. His task was, as simply a human being exposed to every temptation, to overcome everything belonging to the lower level, that is, the human level, and to unite the human level with the divine level. God came down to earth as a human being, but as such was unable to use the divine. We can understand in our small way that otherwise his task would have been easy, and we often wonder why his task was not easy, being of divine origin, that is, that he had in him the divine and as such was the Son of God. Unless we understand this, we cannot realize why he was tempted up to the last moment. We argue in some such way as this: if Christ were the Son of God, why was he tempted? Why did he suffer such agonies? Why was everything so difficult for him? Why could he not simply show people his powers? Why did he not turn stones into bread? But the whole question is infinitely more strange and subtle. At the stage of history when Christ appeared, there was the greatest danger that the human race might be cut off from all communication with a higher level of understanding. The whole world was burning up into violence and materiality. All higher values were disappearing or had disappeared. There was no kind of understanding that man is a spiritual being and not merely a creature of the flesh. And in this situation, someone had to establish the connection between the level of earth and the level of heaven. But you can see that if a man were endowed with powers of a higher level, or the level of heaven as it is called in the Gospels, and having these powers, or rather being able to use these powers on earth, he would not make an example of a human being, raising himself up through inner battles, inner doubts, and human temptations. If you read the Gospels closely, you will see that Christ heard not only many temptations, but many doubts, and even on the cross he said, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Now if we realise that the task of Christ was to connect the human with the divine, the Son of Man with the Son of God, and for this reason he had to suffer everything that a human being must suffer in climbing the ladder of inner development, we can understand the central meaning of the Gospels much better. We can also understand why he had to overcome his mother, as is exemplified in many parables and miracles, because his mother represents his human side. By overcoming, by fulfilling his task, Christ once more established connection between the higher and the lower level, between the spiritual and the natural, and for that reason he had to undergo all his sufferings and finally undergo the death of a criminal without any help being given to him. But by bridging this gap between the human and the divine, he re-established the connection and set things in order once more, and made it possible for the human race to receive influx from a higher level. Christ was therefore two things, and his task was to connect these two things, and for this reason everything that we read about Christ is paradoxical and requires a form of understanding that is not logical in the ordinary sense. He descended and eventually ascended, but his ascent was due to his own efforts. Starting from his birth on this earth from his mother, he had to overcome this birth and be reborn, and for this reason the teaching of the Gospels is full of this idea of rebirth. How often Christ says, "Ye must be reborn," and how difficult it is to understand what this means. But if we catch a glimpse of what we might call the idea of Christ, and the whole drama of his death and resurrection, we can then understand better why in the extraordinary parable or incident called the marriage at Cana, when he turns water into wine, he says to his mother, "Woman, what have I to do with thee?" We can realise that the significance of this incident in the 2nd chapter of John refers to a stage that Jesus had reached in himself, and that it signifies that he had overcome the human side of himself and had at least reached some definite step in this inner evolution. He was now in possession of another level of understanding in the long path of his return to the divine level. He has, for the time being, nothing to do with that side of him represented by the mother, and yet he says to his mother, who will finally crucify him, "Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come." We can understand dimly this means that the human side was not yet overcome, and that the final overcoming of it meant death on the cross. His body came from his mother, and it too had to be triumphed over, and indeed transformed, so that even after its death it could be used as a living and physical body, no longer having its sustenance from life, but from forces outside life. This typified the complete union of the human with the divine, of the lower with the higher. But when Jesus reached the stage of being able to turn water into wine, this complete transmutation had not taken place. It was preceded by a psychological transformation represented by the power of turning water into wine, which in the words of John was his first sign. The miracle followed from the sign. It is not called a miracle but a sign, that is, a sign that Jesus had reached a certain stage of inner power, which he could communicate to representative objects such as water. Water in the ancient representative language of parables is truth. The turning of water into wine signifies the turning of truth into something that is not merely truth, but a stage beyond truth. When you see the truth of truth and its values, truth is no longer simply truth, but becomes full of meaning. What was formerly truth by faith begins to multiply itself into endless meaning, so that it is no longer merely truth, but a continual source of meaning that can intoxicate the soul as wine. A union has taken place between truth and something else. We can call it the meaning of truth, or the good that lies in truth and reaches us through the medium of truth as its recipient. So Jesus calls upon the servants who, if you notice, are commanded by the mother to obey him and to fill the water pots full of water to the brim and transform the water into wine. This means that all the truth that Jesus has acquired can be transformed into its real meaning by him. In our own experience, we sometimes suddenly see the connection between a number of things that have previously been separate and unconnected, and then we understand differently, just as when the separate letters of the alphabet, which are learning as children, magically turn into the words or even whole sentences, and we reach an entirely different level of understanding. Now glance at the end of the parable after Jesus has turned water into wine. This wine is taken to the ruler of the feast, who makes a curious remark. He says that ordinarily that means in life, for the ruler of the feast represents life in its methods, the good wine comes first. Every man setteth on first the good wine, and when men have drunk freely, then that which is worse, thou hast kept the good wine until now. This beginning of his signs did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed on him. Notice the word good is used. In some esoteric teaching, the words truth and good are used, and they speak of a marriage that is possible between truth and good, such that the man sees the good of the truth he has been taught, and so begins to be governed by good and not merely by truth. Notice that the good comes last, in as it were an inverse order to life, as the ruler of the feast indicates. In life we tend to take the good first and the worst afterwards. In this connection it might be said that to climb the ladder of self-development, we must pay beforehand. To the reader, a fuller account of this sign from a rather different point of view can be found in The New Man, which an audio version of can be found on this channel. Esoteric schools. Let us consider some passages where the term wine is used both in the Old and New Testaments in a sense that evidently cannot be literal. When in Genesis chapter 49 verse 11 it is said, "He washed his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes shall be red with wine, and his teeth white with milk," it is fairly apparent that wine has a special meaning connected with what a man wears and how he sees. To imagine that this passage has a literal meaning is to make nonsense of it. Psychologically, what a man dresses in refers not to the literal clothing on the body, but to the clothing of the mind, to the mental beliefs and attitudes. Everyone is dressed up psychologically in opinions and viewpoints which form his mental garments, and his mental eyes view things through them. There is a description of both garments and eyes being washed in some state of insight called wine. Psychologically, a man is dressed in what he believes is true, and mentally he sees by the same means. If wine represents a particular stage in the development of the understanding of truth, the phrase, the eyes being red with wine, refers to the state of vision belonging to it. Some very high state is indicated, a state of the development of the understanding beyond the level of water. In the Apocalypse, in the vision of the 4 horses, it is said of the black horse, "And I saw, and behold, a black horse, and he that sat thereon had a balance in his hand. And I heard a voice saying, A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and the oil and the wine hurt thou not." Revelation chapter 6 verses 5 to 6. It cannot be assumed that the wine here refers to literal wine, nor indeed the oil. At this earthly level of thought indicated by the black horse, where a strict balance rules and everything is measured, so that a man must pay strictly for what he gets, even here there is oil and wine, that is, something higher, and this must not be hurt. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, wine again appears in a significance that can be taken either literally or psychologically. In esoteric teaching, the term vineyard is often used in connection with schools of teaching that seek inner evolution, the attempts made to raise man internally. The schools formed for this purpose are compared with vineyards from which grapes and wine, or of vintage, are expected. For the kingdom of heaven is likened to a man that is a householder, which went out early in the morning to hire labourers into his vineyard. Matthew chapter 20, verse 1. Or, to take another illustration, which shows how easily all teachings about man's inner possibilities and evolution can be distorted or foul. And he began to speak unto them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, and set a hedge about it, and digged a pit for the winepress, and built a tower, and let it out to husbandmen, and went into another country. And at the season he sent to the husbandmen a servant, that he might receive from the husbandmen the fruits of the vineyard. And they took him, and beat him, and sent him away empty. And again he sent unto them another servant, and him they wounded in the head, and handled shamefully. And he sent another, and him they killed, and many others, beating some, and killing some. He had yet one, a beloved son. He sent him last unto them, saying, They will reverence my son. But those husbandmen said among themselves, This is the heir, come, let us kill him, and the inheritance shall be ours. And they took him, and killed him, and cast him forth out of the vineyard. What therefore will the Lord of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the husbandmen, and will give the vineyard into others. Mark chapter 12, verses 1 to 9. There have always been attempts in known history to lift man from the stage of barbarism by the decimation of definite ideas about the deeper meaning of one's life on earth. The inner side of these endeavours is not a matter of ordinary history. All that we can read about is usually a history of the misuse and misinterpretation of the ideas when they pass into life, so that they become sources of political intrigue, greed, violence, horrible persecutions and wars. Yet in our period it is quite clear that if the teaching of Christ, as given in the Sermon on the Mount alone, were followed by humanity, all wars, injustices and social evils would at once cease and a new world would begin. But for this to take place, everyone would have to awaken to what he or she is really like internally. The object of a vineyard is to produce fruit and wine. A definite teaching about the means to an inner stage of development is planted as a vineyard. The prophet Jeremiah complains about the children of Israel and asks them why they want to go back to Egypt, that is, their previous state. And now what hast thou to do in the way of Egypt, to drink the waters of Shahor? God, he says, broke their yoke of old time. I have broken thy yoke and burst thy bands, and thou saidest, I will not serve. For upon every high hill and under every green tree thou didst bow thyself playing the harlot. Yet I had planted thee a noble vine, wholly a right seed. How then art thou turned into the degenerate plant of a strange vine unto me? Jeremiah chapter 2 verses 18 to 21. The meaning is psychological. It is obviously not literal. They are accused of returning to old beliefs, to the state called Egypt, and mixing this teaching or seed with the other teachings, which is called playing the harlot. When a teaching is given, it must be kept pure until it has effected its purpose. It lasts only for a time. In every part of time, different teachings appear and last for longer or shorter periods. Their object is to lift man. They are similar in internal form, insofar as they aim at man's individual evolution through a development of the understanding and quality of his being. Each vineyard is planted to produce its particular wine. There can be no mixing of seed or ideas. This condition is expressed in some words of Moses. Thou shalt not sow thy vine with two kinds of seed. Thou shalt not plough with an ox and an ass. Thou shalt not wear a mixed stuff, wool and linen together. Deuteronomy chapter 22 verse 9. It is evident that these words have meaning apart from their literal sense. but they can of course be taken as observances to be carried out literally, and so without meaning. When a vineyard begins to die, that is, when the significance of the teaching originally planted in it is perverted or lost, it is destroyed. The Old Testament is full of destruction in this sense. Teaching constantly went wrong because people perverted it. The prophet Jeremiah laments the destruction of a school called Moab. With more than the weeping of Jazer will I weep for thee, O vine of Zimmah. Thy branches passed over the sea, they reached even to the sea of Jazer. Upon thy summer fruits and upon thy vintage the spoiler is fallen, and gladness and joy is taken away from the fruitful field and from the land of Moab. And I have caused wine to cease from the winepresses. None shall tread with shouting. The shouting shall be no shouting. Jeremiah chapter 48 verses 32 to 33. This refers to a loss of teaching. The same prophet says in another place, many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard, chapter 12 verse 10. That is, many teachers have destroyed the original teaching. Amos describes the destruction of a teaching in this way. The multitude of your gardens and your vineyards and your fig trees and your olive trees hath the palmer worm devoured. Amos chapter 4 verse 9. The teaching has been eaten up by wrong ideas. Sometimes the grapes are found to be sour, as in Moses' description of the vineyard of those who perverted the truth. For their vine is of the vine of Sodom and of the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of gall, their clusters are bitter, their wine is the poison of dragons and the cruel venom of the asps. Deuteronomy chapter 32 verses 32-33. This happens especially when a teaching or vineyard has become a means of worldly power and of political intrigue, as in the following prophecy about the school called Jerusalem. There shall be no grapes on the vine, no figs on the fig tree, and the leaf shall fade. Jeremiah chapter 8 verse 13. Many other examples could be given. What can be understood is that there has always been teaching of a certain order sown in mankind, and that always there has been a failure of such teaching in process of time. But this does not mean that the teaching has not, at its height, produced results. It fails in time, or, to put it differently, it endures only a certain limited time. It is valuable to understand this because we are inclined to think that a thing should last continuously if it is real and true. But just as there are fashions of every kind, as in science or society or politics, so is the case with esoteric teaching. Yet it is not really the same because it reappears in another form, another guise, and yet in essence is always about the same object, the evolution of man. People must become more conscious first of themselves and then of others. They must forego violence as an easy solution to things. They must genuinely forgive each other, which is only possible by being conscious of themselves and what they are like and what they do. They must behave to others as they would wish others to behave to them, a very difficult thing. They must understand that their lives have another meaning, and that the nature of one's existence is not understandable in terms of things that happen on the earth. They must see the beams in their own eyes before they make an unpleasant uproar about the mote in another's eye. They must cease being good for show. They must stop hatred, stop pretending, stop lying, and so on. All these ideas belong to the way of individual evolution, which esoteric teaching is always about. It is impossible to understand the history of mankind without taking into consideration the influences of esoteric teaching from which we have gained all art and culture. Man without teaching remains barbarian. But as regards the limited extension in time of any particular example of teaching of this quality, we can cite the words of Christ where he warns his pupils that Antichrist is bound to come. Take heed that no man lead you astray, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and shall lead many astray. And ye shall hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for these things must needs come to pass, but the end is not yet. Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 to 6. The consummation of the age. In the esoteric teaching in the Gospels, many references to the second coming of the Son of Man are found. To understand what they mean, it is necessary to realize one of the fundamental ideas of esoteric psychology in reference to the human race on Earth. A particular form of esoteric teaching given at a certain moment in time, that is, historically speaking, lasts only for a limited period. Its force and its meaning gradually begin to die. In the case of the teaching of Christ, which gave meaning and force to many developments in human life, we notice that Christ did not say that this teaching would last forever. He gave a very clear indication that it could only last for a certain time. In this connection, he speaks of what will happen, what signs will occur, when the force, the impulse that was given by his strength, begins to wane in the world. He warns his disciples that a time will come when truth is exhausted, and then speaks about the sign of the second coming of the Son of Man. His disciples ask him what shall be the sign of the second coming of the Son of Man. Disciples came unto Jesus, saying, Tell us when those things shall be, and what is the sign of thy coming, and of the consummation of the age. And Jesus answering said to them, See that no one lead you astray, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and shall lead many astray. But ye shall hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that ye be not disturbed, for all these things must needs be, but the end is not yet. For nation shall be stirred up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes. But all these things are the beginning of sorrows. Matthew chapter 24, verses 3 to 9. The phrase consummation of the age is sometimes translated as end of the world. For this reason, many susceptible people think that a time will come when the visible world will be destroyed. However, in the Greek, the meaning is quite different, and it has nothing to do with the visible world. We rather have to think of the meaning as referring to the end of a period of culture, the end of a phase of humanity, and the beginning of an increasing confusion in which literally nation may rise against nation and so on. But the psychological meaning refers to something quite different. In many of the esoteric books of the Old Testament, which have a meaning quite apart from the literal sense, the idea that truth may fail on the earth is frequently found. When a nation or a people lose their fundamental and traditional values and no longer have any background, they can be compared with an earthquake. Now, when esoteric truth fails, when man becomes entirely sensual, a creature of the senses, and believes nothing else but the evidence of the senses, when all meaning has been destroyed apart from physical meaning, he inevitably begins to degenerate and pass into increasing violence because he has no inner direction and no inner values, which have always been created in him by one form or another of esoteric teaching. Esoteric teaching always gives values beyond physical life, and it is only through these values that any culture can be formed. When all inner values break up, when there is no truth to govern a man more internally, so that he realizes he cannot do certain things owing to a sense of inner integrity, then the end of the world begins. The whole force of inner development begins to die, the whole idea that man is on this earth to learn something, the whole possibility of inner development ceases. And when this is widespread, it is the consummation of the age. The force brought into the world away back in time is exhausted. But we have to notice that when this happens, a second coming is at hand. From Matthew chapter 24, we can see that man, regarded psychologically from the standpoint of higher and esoteric teaching, must be given truth to lift him from the level of violence, self-interest and appetite, and that when this truth by its passage through generation after generation becomes completely distorted, a period of confusion follows which leads to a second manifestation of the truth, represented as the second coming of the Son of Man. People imagine that truth will always maintain itself, But all truth wears itself out, and a new form of the same truth must be sown on humanity. Every nation, every race has been given truth. It is always the same truth, but given in different forms, sometimes with the emphasis more on one side or more on another side, according to the conditions of the time. But when truth of this kind breaks up and loses all its guiding force, when it has lost all its effective power, there is a consummation of the age followed by a period of confusion, which heralds the coming of another form of the same truth. With this brief description, we can perhaps realize that the consummation of the age does not mean the end of the world, but the end of one manifestation of the truth, and also that it will be inevitably followed by a new manifestation of truth, which of course may take centuries to come into force. It is a cycle that recurs. So we can understand that the Son of Man will come again, for this means the renewal of esoteric teaching on the earth. The force is given and gradually dies away in time. The period of chaos follows. The force once more comes down again. Each manifestation is called in the esoteric teaching of Christ the second coming of the Son of Man, of some being taking on the level of humanity, raising himself up through his own overcoming of all human temptations, and once more re-establishing order, and so again opening the way for human development. The higher level is then once more open to the lower level, and the purpose of man's original creation to pass from a lower to a higher level of being and understanding is once more made possible. What then is this truth that is sown into the world at definite intervals to lift man beyond his senses? Is it merely a question of arbitrary literal commandments? We can notice that Christ began his teaching not with any literal commandments, but with a psychological idea, the idea of metanoia, which means change of mind. Esoteric teaching begins with the idea that change of mind is the first thing. This word, metanoia, awkwardly translated as repentance, means a new way of thinking about the meaning of one's own life. Esoteric teaching is to make us think differently. That is its starting point, to feel the mystery of one's own existence, of how one thinks and feels and moves, and to feel the mystery of consciousness, and to feel the mystery of the minute organization of matter. All this can begin to affect metanoia in a man. The contrary is to feel that everything is attributable to oneself. The one feeling opens the mind to its higher range of possibilities. The other feeling closes the mind and turns us downwards through the senses. War in heaven. Things do not remain the same. Behold, the former things are come to pass, and new things do I declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. Isaiah chapter 42, verse 9. But apparently it is not only conditions on earth that change, but in heaven also. There shall be a new heaven and a new earth. Revelation chapter 21, verse 1. Moreover, it is indicated that those in heaven do not necessarily remain there when a new heaven is created. We read of there being war in heaven, of Michael and his angels fighting with the dragon and his angels. Revelation chapter 12, verse 7. The dragon and his angels were cast out of heaven, neither was their place found any more in heaven. They seem to represent all those who externally are moral and pious, but inwardly have no belief. Christ laid great stress on the necessity for inner belief and the uselessness of outer religion only. It would appear that the outer practice of religion may be rewarded by a sojourn in some kind of heaven which comes to an end. As in their life on earth, these people who inwardly believe nothing but are externally rigid, literal and forbidding are compared to dragons. There is nothing of grace about the dragon-faced. Peter says, "We look for new heavens and a new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness." 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 13. It is clear that self-righteousness which comes from pride is not meant, for it has no connection with righteousness which springs from inner goodness. Christ said some things about the changing nature of the kingdom of heaven. speaking of John the Baptist, after saying, "Among them that are born of women there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist, notwithstanding he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." He goes on to say, "From the days of John the Baptist until now the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force." Matthew chapter 11 verse 12. What can this strange remark mean? It can only mean that the conditions of entry into the new kingdom of heaven change. From the time that the Baptist began to preach to the beginning of Christ's teaching, there was a period where the violent take it by force. Does this mean that those who did violence to themselves gained the kingdom, or has it an entirely different meaning? The conditions of entry into the kingdom of heaven and the frequent mention of a covenant being made between God and man are connected. A covenant is an agreement made between two persons to the effect that if one of them fulfills certain conditions, the other will do what he promised. It is not permanent, as the phrase covenant of an age shows. The Hebrew word olam, translated often in the Old Testament as everlasting, really means age-lasting, lasting for an aeon, as in the passage in Jeremiah chapter 32 verse 40. "And I will make an everlasting covenant with them, that I will not turn away from them, to do them good." In a developing humanity which is being raised from a state of relative barbarism, it would not be expected to be permanent. The 10 Commandments given to the Israelites on Mount Sinai were a covenant between God and Israel. If the Israelites obeyed them, God would prosper them. "If ye walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, I will have respect unto you, and make you fruitful and multiply you, and establish my covenant with you. And if ye shall despise my statutes, or if your soul abhor my judgments, so that ye will not do all my commandments, but that ye break my covenant, I will destroy your high places, and cut down your images, and cast your carcasses upon the carcasses of your idols, and my soul shall abhor you." Leviticus chapter 26 verses 3, 9, 15, 30. The commandments are about what was to be done and about what must not be done. That was the mark to aim at. Consider the first commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," and the last, "Thou shalt not cover thy neighbour's house, thou shalt not cover thy neighbour's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbour's." Exodus chapter 20 verse 3:17. Are these possible to carry out? It has often been said that what a man loves most is really his God. A man may of course imagine he loves God before everything. In that case he does not notice himself. Although self-love is a giant power, it is not easy to observe even a fraction of it. When it peeps out unmistakably, we justify ourselves at once. Again, who can say that he is aware of all his forms of covetousness, and that they have no power over him? If he said so, does he observe himself enough? Sin means to miss the mark. In the New Testament, the word translated as sin is taken from aiming an arrow at a mark and missing it. In the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments were the mark, that is, the law. Christ said he brought a new law: love one another. He speaks of a certain kind of love, conscious love, and not of emotional love, which changes so easily into its opposite. "A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another, as I have loved you, that ye also love one another." John chapter 13 verse 34. Christ speaks in a parable at the end of the age. He uses the word aeon, which refers to a period during which certain possibilities and conditions exist. With the coming of Christ, one of these periods began, and with it certain conditions for entry into the kingdom of heaven. Those who followed the teaching of Christ sincerely from their hearts and not merely externally could gain the kingdom of heaven. The parable, which is usually called the parable of the tares and the wheat, is as follows. The kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat, and went his way. But when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? From whence then hath it tares? He said unto them, An enemy hath done this. The servants said unto him, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest while ye gather up the tares, ye root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather ye together first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 to 30. Christ explains that this parable is about the end of the aeon, not world as it is translated. He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world, this aeon. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. Matthew chapter 13, verses 37 to 43. This explanation of the parable refers to the termination of a period of conscious selection. In each age there is the idea of selection, not blind but intelligent. Each age or period appears to bring about a different kind of selection. In one short parable, Christ compares the kingdom of heaven in general to fishermen using a net to catch fish. When they had got sufficient, they selected the good and threw the useless away. Again, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a net that was cast into the sea, and gathered of every kind, which, when it was full, they drew to shore and sat down, and gathered the good into vessels, but cast the bad away. Matthew chapter 13, verses 47 to 48.